Hi, my name's Marcus and welcome to Recess. My guest today is Professor Naomi Winstone. Naomi is a cognitive psychologist focusing and specializing on feedback, including the processing and impact of instructional feedback. She is a professor of educational psychology at the University of Surrey, where she is also the director of the Surrey Institution of Education. She is an associate fellow, an honorary associate fellow at the University of Deakin, Australia, as well as a principal fellow and a national teaching fellow. Naomi is here to talk today about feedback. Thank you, Naomi.
So when we start to think about the topic of feedback in higher education, I think we often perceive this to be a problem. Feedback is often framed as a problem in the National Student Survey, for example, and in the way in which often we experience students' perceptions of feedback within their programmes. I think it's important to question whether or not there is a problem with feedback in terms of universal poor performance or poor practice, or whether it's the complexity of feedback and the very human responses to being evaluated and being critiqued that might be underlying some of these challenges. So in my work, I am primarily interested in the impact of feedback. As educators, we spend an incredibly long time providing feedback comments on student work. It's probably one of the most time-consuming parts of an academic role. And certainly the staff that I talk to often report frustration when they feel that perhaps students aren't engaging with that information, or perhaps they're seeing the same mistakes coming up time and time again. So there's this sense that perhaps some of the time they've spent providing feedback might in fact be wasted. So what I try to look at is how we can improve the feedback process so that we get away from that sense of wasted time and we're able to think about not just how we provide feedback as educators, but how we provide an environment where students are able to use feedback effectively and for it to have a real impact on their learning and their future work. So I've talked about two different paradigms of feedback in my work. We have the old paradigm of feedback, which has dominated educational practice for many, many years. And in this old paradigm of feedback, when we're talking about feedback, we're really talking about comments. We're talking about the information that we might provide to learners after they've completed a piece of work. And so we naturally focus on what teachers are doing. They're the ones driving the feedback process because they're the ones providing the comments. And therefore, when feedback processes are identified as not working particularly well, it's automatically the fault of the educator for not providing feedback in an effective way. Now, there's all sorts of assumptions underlying that old paradigm which are problematic. In contrast, a new paradigm approach to feedback shifts the focus away from what teachers do to what students do. So rather than thinking about feedback as comments, we think about feedback as an ongoing process where learners make sense of information about their work or their performance, and where they use that information in the future to make a change in terms of perhaps their attitudes, their motivation, their approaches to study, or indeed their actual skills that relate to their discipline. And because we're focusing on what the students do now, we're less interested in the actions of teachers. In fact, once comments have been provided on student work, rather than that being the end of the feedback process, as it is in an old paradigm view, that's the start. That's where learners begin their interaction with the information and where it starts to have the potential for impact. And we also need to think then about feedback processes more holistically if we find that perhaps something isn't working very well within a feedback process. Rather than placing the blame on educators for having not done feedback well, we need to think about the wider process. Were learners supported to use feedback? Could they see the value of it? And was it able to inform future work? Now, making that shift from an old paradigm to a new paradigm fundamentally encourages us to think about design. How are we designing feedback processes? Now, we often talk about assessment design in education, the planning we make when we're thinking about how to assess students' learning. Yet rarely do we talk about feedback design. But it's incredibly important that when planning a module or a programme, we think about how feedback is going to work and how we're going to structure opportunities for students to work with feedback. An example of where design is really important in our thinking is if we imagine a module or a unit where students have completed a piece of work which has been marked and feedback comments have been provided. That work has been returned to students, and we look at the analytics of student engagement with that feedback and find that they haven't really opened, let alone read, the feedback information that's been provided. Now, on the one hand, we could look at that as poor engagement on the part of students. They're not interested. I would look at that as a problem with design, that maybe that feedback has been provided at a point within the cycle where it's not useful to students. Perhaps they've moved on to another module or unit, or it's coming at a point where they can't use it to inform future work. There's no transfer. So that's an example of where design thinking is really important. David Bowd, who's at Deakin University in Australia, talks about the importance of feedback having a landing place, and this is a fundamental design issue. When we provide feedback to students, we need to think about where they can use that feedback, where the landing places are. And it could be a task that they'll be doing very, very quickly in the same module or unit. It could be that they can apply that feedback to a landing place in a similar module they'll be doing the next semester. Or it might be that the landing place for that particular feedback won't come for another couple of years. For example, where feedback on a lab report in the first year of a programme would have a landing place in informing approaches to their final year dissertation project, for example. So that's where design comes in. The other thing that I'm particularly interested in is supporting students' engagement with feedback. And I think about this in terms of the skills that they need to be able to use feedback effectively. I think we often assume that the capacity to use feedback well is something that we know how to do. We've all had experience of using feedback in education, in the workplace, in our personal lives. So we assume that this is a skill that we all just know how to do, but that's really not the case. So some of the work that I've been doing is looking at how to support students to develop those skills that support their use of feedback, not just for education, but also for their future working lives. So we can think about what students need to be able to do, and then we can think about how we can make space within the curriculum for students to develop those skills. And I deliberately say in the curriculum because what we tend to find is that approaches to supporting students' use of feedback and developing those skills that are run as optional bolt-on sessions tend to be much less useful than approaches that take advantage of the subject that students are studying and their curriculum and embedding discussion of the use of feedback within the curriculum. I'll give you an example. In healthcare disciplines, for example, where students might be learning about models of behaviour change and how to support patients or clients they might be working with to change or develop their behaviour. Now that's part of the students' disciplinary study, it's part of the content of the curriculum, but it's highly relevant to opening up a discussion about the importance of using feedback that relates to their educational work as well. Because if the client that they're working with doesn't take their feedback on board, they're unlikely to see the change in their behaviour that the professional and the client or patient will be working towards. And there's lots of these synergies where we can talk about feedback and open up that space within the context of the curriculum. There's one other crucial thing that we need to be aware of when thinking about feedback and students' responses to feedback, and that's emotion. Now, we've all had experiences, I'm sure, of where feedback can feel very personal and we have an emotional reaction to that feedback. Perhaps we feel paralysed or angry, and it can be very difficult then to take action without maybe letting it sit for a while and to overcome that emotional response. And there's loads of research that tells us that the relationship between emotion and student response to feedback is really complex. It's certainly not as simple as positive emotions being a good thing in terms of encouraging engagement with feedback and negative emotions discouraging engagement with feedback. There are some examples of emotions that are really quite positive, like relief, that actually lead to disengagement because we feel happy with how we've performed and therefore don't necessarily see the need to engage with feedback in the same way. And there are also negative emotions. Anxiety is a good example, which can actually lead to action because we're in a state that we want to get out of. And so that can be an activating emotion in terms of encouraging further work or doing something to try and move forwards from that situation. So returning to the point I made at the beginning, is feedback a problem? Feedback is certainly a challenge, and it's something that we need to recognise as being a challenge on a human level, not just on a student level. This isn't a problem with our students that they find using feedback difficult. There is a lot of research, certainly in the psychological literature, about why using feedback is difficult across the board, not just within education. But if we want to make feedback more meaningful for ourselves as educators and for our students, we need to think about the approach we take. So moving from that old paradigm to the new paradigm, situating students in a really active way within the process. We need to think about design, how we are building in opportunities for feedback within our modules, within our programs, and in particular, how we're encouraging students and enabling them to use feedback. Thinking about those landing places, where will students be able to apply the feedback that we're providing, and how can we help them to be more aware of those opportunities? Thinking about the skills that students need to use feedback effectively and how within the curriculum we can help them to develop those skills. And then being aware of the role of emotion in response to feedback, opening up those conversations, perhaps sharing with students some of the challenges we've had when using critical feedback, and normalising the challenge, but helping them to move forwards to use emotion in a much more positive, activating way rather than being paralysed by emotion. So there is a problem, there is a challenge, but it's not the one I think is often painted in the media, that assessment and feedback processes are really poor or terrible within higher education. Quite the opposite. I think often there's some really good practice, but it's shifting our thinking in ways that help us to look towards making assessment and feedback a much more enjoyable and productive process rather than something that often results in what appears to be wasted time.
Thank you, Naomi. I started writing so many notes down in preparation to ask questions, but everything I wrote down was then later answered. I find it fascinating to think about trying to find the right level of challenge of this feedback to provide to students, so you don't create that sense of relief and disengagement, or you don't create that level of anxiety. And that really highlights, I can't pronounce his name very well, but Shanksmi High's flow channel, and there's how there's a relationship between the feedback we provide and the flow channel, and that I had never really considered before. So thank you for sparking that in my mind. I have a quote I'm going to read verbatim, and then I'm going to ask a question. So here we come to a paradox. Though the university community is a major force of innovation in our society, it is curiously resistant, even hostile to innovations attempted within the university. The universities send out skilled specialists who spearhead purposeful change, but those specialists in the strategy and techniques of innovation crowd the campus. Rarely are their skills brought to bear on the university itself. Now, that's from the 1960s. So that issue is still prominent, albeit you say that the issue is not as the media portray. There are still sometimes a large lag between what the researchers are highlighting and what is contemporarily happening in universities. So my question is to you is, what is the practical first step that someone should take when trying to migrate from that old paradigm to the new paradigm?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think the most useful thing to do is to have a look at the cycle of assessment within that particular context, whether that's a module or over a programme, and look at where time is being invested in feedback. So I think one of the common reasons why assessment and feedback processes don't develop in line with the literature is because of the workload and the time involved in assessment and feedback. And I think there's often a perception that if we're going to do these extra things, like to help students develop the skills needed to use feedback effectively, or approach a different take a different approach to feedback, is going to add to workload. I believe that the developments that we make should be workload neutral, maybe even beneficial in terms of workload. And so one example of that is to look at the module cycle and think about where time is being invested in feedback. Where is that academic resource being used? And can it be repurposed to a different point in the cycle where it's going to have the the most impact on students? Feedback often comes at the end because it's tied in with assessment, and those things often go together. We talk about assessment and feedback. But is there an opportunity to reduce the amount of commentary at the end of an assessment cycle and repurpose some of that to a different part of the process where it can directly impact student learning and where it does have a landing place? So I think that's the most important thing to do, is look at where that resource is currently being invested and think about where it could be maybe repurposed to have more of an impact.
Okay, and then one follow-up question would be, in regards to the use of PGTAs, or postgraduate teaching assistants, do you believe that they are at a place to provide continuous feedback throughout the semester, or should this be left to the module lead?
No, I think there's a really important role for postgraduate teaching assistants, demonstrators, different terms in different contexts. I think they can be really valuable in being able to, as you say, follow a student's journey and provide that kind of ipsative feedback in relation to prior performance and feedback on improvement in a way that perhaps academic staff can't. I think the problem comes where those PGTAs are not given enough support and guidance from the module leader. They may go through central training on how to provide effective feedback, but that's very different in the context of a module and even within the context of an assessment within that module. So having that sort of coaching and guidance from the module leader to help them develop their feedback skills, I think is really important, but definitely a very valuable part of a teaching team.
Fantastic. Thank you, Naomi, and I really appreciate all your time.
Thank you.